Joseph Wasikongo, who's the National Coordinator of the Elimu Yetu Coalition, and Dr. Judith Olo, who's the Regional Director of Each Rights. Many thanks for staying with me here in studio. And Dr. Judith, let's look at the human rights perspective regarding access to education. What kind of issues arise, especially here in Kenya, in terms of rights to access?
From a human rights perspective, the importance of education cannot be underscored over what has been done already. We find it in various instruments, international instruments, of which Kenya is a party to, and even in the Constitution of Kenya, Article 43 and Article 53. Now, in terms of accessibility, we have seen that the population keeps increasing, and especially in urban areas, there's been influx of people from the villages to the urban areas, and it has become almost impossible for the government to provide facilities, educational facilities for all of these people. And this has created a situation in which children have been kept out of school owing to the fact that the facilities are limited, or if they are there, they are very far, and accessing them is a problem. And accessibility is not literal accessibility that children cannot access the schools, but sometimes we find that the schools charge some fees, which, or even uniform fees, that lock children from very poor families who cannot afford uniform fees, lunch fees, or even school fees. These children are locked out and they are further marginalized. Yeah? And that is a big problem.
Right. Yeah. And Joseph, let's talk about global strides that have been made with regards to the Education for All movement. And remember, this was birthed out of that Jomtien conference in 1990. So 28 years later, how much strides have been made?
I think after the Jomtien, I mean, we had about six goals that were being that nations were pushing in terms of ensuring education for all. But then come 2015, when now the Millennium Development Goals had done their time, in quotes, and now we are transiting to Sustainable Development Goals. The world met in Incheon, Korea, and they set new targets, because there was a general feeling that though something was attained, it wasn't enough. We hadn't really exactly gotten to the goals. So new targets were set, and there were 7 targets that were set for the realization of education in a framework that is now popularly known as Education 2030.
Yes.
And just in line with the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. And so the global community set goals related to access of primary and secondary school children, and even their completion. At that particular level, they set goals with regards to early childhood development education, so that they are prepared to join primary school. They set goals with regard to access to tertiary education, and now polytechnic, vocational, etc. They set goals in terms of ensuring that the youth actually have relevant skills to be able to be relevant to the job market. They set goals related to address gender disparities and other forms of marginalizations, including those ones touching to children with disabilities. They also set goals in terms of ensuring that we have learners who can be global citizens, who can actually contribute to the process of sustainable development. And in terms of reaching this, they underscored the importance of ensuring that we have got a conducive learning environment for the learners, and also ensuring that we have got an adequate supply of teachers, qualified teachers, to ensure that we really have learners who benefit from not only education, but education that is of quality. Yes.
And let me just stay with you, Joseph, for just a bit before I talk with Dr. Judith. I guess we cannot overstate the importance of how this framework and the guidelines has really helped, the entire globe towards marking the strides made and even guiding what really are the ideals to reach in terms of trying to give access to all in terms of education. But how critical is the issue of capacity as individual nations now come towards these global goals? Are poorer nations disadvantaged in terms of attaining this SDGs? And is there a global responsibility in terms of providing that capacity? Should it be financial, technical, training, so that there's, a concerted move towards these goals?
Yes. In terms of capacity, of course, different countries have got different capacities in terms of realizing these particular goals. But there's also something that is happening globally that we can say, now, this is something good. For example, the concept of development effectiveness. Some time ago, in terms of addressing that element of capacity, you'd find that the northern countries or the donor countries would provide aid to the southern countries and just make this assumption that it would reach where it gets to. But there's a concept of development effectiveness. And what that means is that I am going to give you aid, and I am going to give you the necessary capacity to ensure that you get to those goals. That is something beautiful that is happening at the moment.
Absolutely.
And what also that means is that in the process of development effectiveness, every other person is being brought on board. The civil society, the state, every other person is being involved, so that in the education sector, we are not just saying that it's the government alone. The civil society will be involved, the teacher unions will be involved. This is the concept of development effectiveness. Is making
it's a collective
it's a collective endeavor. So that even for this, for the civil society, I think we are beginning to see a change from that very tension-based relationship between the state and the civil society to actually each and every on the other side looking at the other as a partner.
To some more meaningful engagement.
Meaningful engagement. That is courtesy to such good elements like development effectiveness and even this yarn of good governance. So that we are saying, I am going to give you support, but in return, what is going to happen is that you're going to ensure there's transparency, there's accountability, there's the respect to the rule of law, there's the element of addressing the needs, in this particular case, matters related to education. There's the important element of ensuring that everyone participates. And there's the effectiveness and efficiency of the use of resources.
Thank you, Joseph. And just before we wrap up the conversation, very crucial and important and enjoyable conversation we've had this morning on this. Dr. Judith, there has been increased privatization of schools in Kenya. And I don't know what this then means in terms of access. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Talk to us about that and what it means on the bigger picture.
Thank you. Now, privatization of education in Kenya has been on the rise, as you rightly say, and mostly because the private investors or those who are investing in schools privately are seeking to bridge the gap that the government is not able to satisfy, considering the big numbers. However, privatization has its good sides in the sense that it's been able to make education more accessible. But on the other hand, privatization has had its negative effects. For example, like what I said earlier, if private schools are not able to comply with the Basics of Education Act, what the Education Act provides that they should comply with, if the informal schools or the upbed schools are not complying to the update regulations, then we find that education in those private schools are compromised or is compromised. And what that means for us, because we look at education from a human rights perspective, is that the effect is that children who study in those schools do not get the same quality of education as what is gotten in public schools. On the other hand, one of the reasons why private schools are on the rise is because the government provides the basic of basic standards in public education system. And that is why people decide that instead of taking my child to a public school, I'd rather take them to a private school.
The parents get concerned about the quality.
Yes, and so if the quality, if the government is providing bare minimum at the public schools, then only those who do not have a choice but to have their children there will have their children. Those who are able to take their children to better schools will do that.
Okay, and many thanks. We want to just wrap up by having closing remarks, looking behind as we look forward in terms of, if that makes sense, in terms of what we can expect and what we can suggest in terms of reaching those targets for Kenya.
In closing for me, in terms of moving ahead, if we are going to realize this, for us to have a win-win, we must begin from this particular point that it is only the government that can be trusted to provide inclusive, equitable, and quality education. If we begin engaging all the stakeholders from that particular point, we'll be able to address the gaps and make the realization of quality education for every child a reality.
All right.
Yes.
Very briefly, because we want to cross over your closing remarks in a nutshell.
I would say that the government should do more in terms of establishing schools in urban areas, especially considering that at this point up to 850 children are out of school in urban areas because of accessibility.
All right. Many thanks, Joseph Wasihongo, who is the National Coordinator of the Elimu Yetu Coalition, and Dr. Judith Olo, the Regional Director for Each Rights. Many thanks for this very important conversation that you joined me to have.
Thank you.